Hello, everyone, and welcome to the October 2023 ENSO seminar. We are delighted to be joined today by Enara Garcia at the University of the Basque Country, although in the process of transition. So the kind of division of the research career as you broaden your horizons to include the University of Granada, and then gradually sort of fix or individuate yourself into one position or another. So I'm very grateful, Enara, for coming on today and for sharing your work with us today. Just to give a quick introduction to our viewers about Enara's work, she's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of the Basque Country in the Department of Philosophy there. Her work covers two principal categories. First is refining the relational and process-oriented ontology that serves as the foundation for enactive theory, which involves engaging both with classical philosophical discussions about primarily the essence of mental disorders, and also within the realm of philosophy of science. So I guess today we'll hear more strongly from the second branch, or the second aspect of Enara's work, which looks at the affectivity and the impact of affective atmospheres, which encompass pathetic, blurred, and pre-individual forms of room-encompassing emotional experiences and the process of therapeutic change. And that's part of a broader exploration of the relationship between health and the environment. Enara has a background in psychotherapy and is deeply involved in therapeutic work, and is further developing the concept of therapeutic atmospheres within her research work. So you're very welcome, Enara, and as I say, thank you once again for joining us and for sharing your work today.
Thank you, Marek. Thank you for inviting me here and for organizing this wonderful workshop. I follow almost every month, and yeah, I think you are doing a great work in disseminating enactive ideas and building our community. So thank you for that. For me, it's a kind of honor to be here. And before starting, I would like to share with you as a kind of advertisement.
Yeah, we'll get straight to our commercial break, as we tend to do at this point. Okay. So give people a chance to come on board and catch up on the live stream there. So there's the research topic underway.
Yeah, let me share with you. Can you see it? Yeah.
Yes, coming up perfectly there.
Yeah, I wanted just to share with you the collection I'm coordinating together with Mariana Lozaida, Paola D'Adamo, and Alejandro Chau. This is a research topic in Frontiers on an enactive approach to health that gathers different quantitative and qualitative research or studies applying enactive ideas to a wide variety of health-related issues. And we have diverse contributions on women's health, neurodiversity, empathy in clinical settings, autonomy in childhood, and also mental health. And I look forward to seeing this research topic released completely soon. I think it's going to be fully released by January, hopefully.
Super. No, it's brilliant to see the enactive approach has, it drags us in and is sort of fascinating in and of itself, but it has always had a rather abstract and kind of difficult to parse and put into practical terms aspect to it. As we don't have the tools or the concepts really to cope with embodiment, it's taken several decades of work to get to that point. So to see it being integrated into these kind of more applied domains is always very exciting. Actually, it's great to see this kind of work being done.
Yeah, thank you.
Superb. So with that, I guess we might progress to the seminar itself. So I will invite you to begin the October 2023 ENSO seminar on affectivity in mental disorders and an enactive-simondonian approach.
Yeah. Can you see the slides? Yeah. Yes. So today I'm going to speak about recent work that has been published on phenomenology and the cognitive science under the title of Affectivity in Mental Disorders, an enactive-simondonian approach. And I have to say that also it's an already published work. I consider it, as always, as a work in progress, as a kind of proposal of looking, of a particular way of looking at affectivity in mental disorders. And I do so by introducing Simondon's philosophy in the rationale of the enactive approach. And I think this is relevant because Gilbert Simondon provides a kind of ontological system, a process and relational ontological system that I think goes along with some enactive principles and can allow us to understand, to better understand the role of affectivity in mental disorders. And I have even heard this term of the Simondonian term in enactivism. Also, I have to say, I think that the consequences of this theoretical influence are yet to be seen. And just as a kind of clarification or contextualization, Simondon, despite being Canguilhem's and Merleau-Ponty's student, he is not a phenomenologist, and he did not address the problem of health and disease whatsoever. So this is a kind of application of Simondonian ideas to specific problems. Indeed, I have to say that he challenges two fundamental elements or principles of the phenomenological tradition, namely the privilege of the subject as a starting point of the phenomenological analysis, and second, this methodological principle of bracketing any sort of ontological claims beyond experience. But as I will explain, I think his philosophy allows us actually to describe how dynamical principles that rule physical and biological individuation can also describe the genesis of intentional structures in the experiential domain. So I think this goes along with this enactive endeavor of naturalizing phenomenology. And just to say, we can situate Simondonian philosophy or his analysis of affects in the Spinoza-Deleuzian tradition or affect theory. So in this paper, the aim or the argument of this paper is quite simple, I would say. The idea is that since from an enactive perspective, sense-making and whatever is the mental is conceived as inherently affective, then this claim that mental disorders involve disorders of affectivity follows almost straightforwardly. But I think this is not very informative unless we are able to make some distinctions. And indeed, I think, and I claim that any account of mental disorders as disorders of affectivity should incorporate phenomenological distinctions between different forms of affective experience. And I refer to this distinction between emotions, moods, atmospheres, and existential feelings as already drawn by Thomas Fuchs. So the aim is to elaborate a phenomenologically-informed account of mental disorders as disorders of affectivity that coherently integrates different modes of affective experiences. But let's go step by step here. As a matter of introduction, we can say, you already know, the enactive approach is a branch of embodied cognition theories that brings together insights from the organizational approach in biology, dynamical systems theory, and phenomenology, and provides a naturalistic but non-reductionist account of cognition. So cognition from an enactive perspective is defined as sense-making. That is, this evaluative interaction of the organism with its environment that brings forth or enacts a word of significance. And here, living beings are understood as adaptive and autonomous systems that actively maintain their own identity. So the idea is that individuality is not just defined by a physical boundary, like by self-distinction, but also by the self-maintaining and self-producing activity of the organism. So I think the point that I want to stress here is that sense-making does not take place in an already finished individual, but the individuation of the living being and its sense-making processes are deeply intertwined. So in humans, this has to be read in the context of unfinished and ongoing process of human becoming. And one of the consequences of the enactive theory is that this self-word distinction is not taken for granted or is not taken as a static and pre-given, but the self and the word are not independent or prior to our experiential encounters, but they co-emerge from the interaction with the environment. And I think this is the key of the enactive slogan of this idea that the path is laid down by walking. And I like how Richard Gibbs would put it, like the path of the ego boundary or this self-word structure. I'm using both ego boundary or self-word structure interchangeably. They are laid down at the same time as the walking of perceptual experience. And just to clarify, this does not imply that the self is built up out of scratch in every perceptual act, but the ego boundaries are constrained by the developmental time, also constraining, but not determining the potential or the possibilities of future experiences. So in sum, we can say that this distinction between the self and the world emerges from the organism's environmentally structured, ongoing, temporally changed moments of sensorimotor activity. And this goes pretty much in line with Simondon's philosophy of individuation, because Simondon invites us to think of this ontogenetic process by which individuals come into being or come to be, instead of focusing on finished, static, and fully constituted entities. So it's a shift in our perspective in the analysis. So he's interested in understanding this process of co-emergence of the self and the world, or the entities, the self in relation to its particular milieu. So he focuses on the immanent principles of change and becoming in different domains of reality, like physical, organic, psychic, and trans-individual or intersubjective domains. And I think that's why his philosophy is interesting to understand or to describe this unfinished character of embodiment in organic, sensorimotor, psychic, or an intersubjective dimension in enactivism. And just as a matter of technical vocabulary, Simondon uses the term metastability to describe the dynamics of individuation. And a metastable system has to be understood as an inherently tension system. So it's a system that holds tensions from or demands from inherently conflicting forces. That is, it harbors potentials that have sometimes contradictory tendencies and can actually or effectively be incompatible. So this is a kind of productive tension that allows for transformation and change. And we can see, I think, this idea of the living being as a tension system in this dialectical tension between self-production and self-distinction in enactivism, or as well as Mayes's idea of the tension between rational identities that coexist within the individual, or the Varela's concept of the meshwork of selfless selves. And another key concept in Simondon is this idea of the pre-individual, which refers to these potentialities or this potential energy of the system that is not yet actualized, is not yet structured, but keeps somehow the metastable condition of the system, so as to allow for its transformation and change. And yeah, this, let's say, pre-individual or potential tension is also what allows for the system to be flexible and behave adaptively. So one consequence of this excess of potential energy of the living being is that these pre-individual potentialities are not yet internal or external to the organism, but they are kind of available to build this organizational boundary that determines this division between the self and the world. And we can apply these dynamics of individuation to different domains, to the physical, organic, and psychic domains. I'm not going to go into details into the first two ones, but just as a matter of examples, in the physical realm, Simondon uses the example of crystallization, where the process of forming of crystals, where free-floating molecules in a supersaturated solution constitute the potentialities or this pre-individual load for a crystal, but they are not yet the crystal. And in the organic domain, for instance, the caloric potential of food constitutes the potentialities for the organic structure of the living body or for its activity, but it's not yet the living body. And likewise, and I will focus on this more in the next slides, in the psychic realm, the affective forces we experience somehow constitute the potentialities for certain thoughts and acts, but they are not yet thoughts and acts. So from this perspective, sense-making can be seen as a form of psychic individuation. And this implies, or this means, that sense-making is not only making sense of the external world or the external environment, but also building the intentional structures or the intentional frameworks from which the world can be experienced. So it's not only about making sense of the external world, but also building the sense of self that goes along with those experiences. And notice that here I'm doing a kind of move from static phenomenology to genetic phenomenology. And this distinction was originally made by Husserl. And the idea is that while static phenomenology describes these formal structures of consciousness, such as intentionality, this subject-object transitivity, and so on, genetic phenomenology does not take those structures for granted, but studies the genesis of those structures from more basic processes. And I think that both for Husserl and also in the enactive approach, and also in the Simondonian philosophy, affectivity plays a crucial role in explaining this emergence of intentionality and the self-worth transitive structure. So, as you may already know, Giovanna Colombetti already pointed out that sense-making from an enactive perspective is inherently affective and normative. So cognition is not a matter of detached representation of the world, but the embodied subject is primarily an affective one, whose primary relation with the world is of commitment and care. So the idea is that the world is never neutral to the individual, but is always balanced as positive, negative, repelling or attractive, depending on the self-organization of the individual, their needs and their goals. And here, affects are not mere accompaniments of mental states that tinge them with a certain color, but they are constitutive aspects of conscious experience. And from a Simondonian perspective, we can say that affects operate over these pre-individual potentialities for change and becoming. So they kind of mediate in this transition from potentialities to actualities in sense making. And I think similar ideas can be found in Varela's account of affectivity as modulating the temporal flow of experience. Varela would place affectivity as modulating the protensional field, which is the field of the experience that is about to be. So I think both have this idea of affects modulating potential experiences, the experiences that are not yet actual. And I like pretty much how Vrušek and Sluneko put it in this paper that I highly recommend reading. And they say that affective resonance is what orders and organizes the divergent pre-individual processes and potentialities in an interior-exterior polar axis, providing a primordial orientation to the individual with respect to its associated milieu. So, and the problem that I wanted to face here is how we can integrate these different affective forms within this Simondonian picture. And my proposal is that each form of affective experience connects us with a different range of potentialities for change in this self-worth relationship. And I think this is manifested in the dynamics and the intentional structure of each form of affective experience as described already in phenomenology. And let me go one by one explaining these differences. So I will start from the bottom. If we look at emotions, for instance, emotions have a clear subject-object intentional structure. So emotions are not only word-directed, but they are object-directed. So unlike other forms of affectivity, such as moods or atmospheres, they have an inherent action tendency, so they imply a disposition to action. Moreover, emotions are felt as belonging to the individual, to an already constituted subject. So imagine, for instance, when we are in a very intense emotion, we feel ourselves more intensely. So we feel our emotions as belonging to us. But since they are episodic experiences, more intense and temporally bounded than moods, for instance, I think they operate over a relatively narrow and transitory range for potentialities for resignification of the self. So the idea here is that they call for concrete actions, but emotions do not call for transformation of the whole self-worth relationship. So moods, however, are less intense and more extended in time than emotions. They have a longer cadence and their effects are extended beyond the immediate future. So, and the intentionality of moods is not object directed, but is word directed in a more general sense. So think, for instance, of anxiety as an objectless fear. So moods also shape our habitual way of relating with the world. So they individuate us in a certain way because they shape our character. And at the same time, they shape somehow the landscape of the concrete emotions that are available for the individual. So think, for instance, an irascible person is more likely to feel anger, for instance. So they shape our characters. And they thus relate us with a wider landscape of potentialities for change than emotions. Let's say changing your habitual moods is a kind of changing yourself. In turn, affective atmospheres are defined as affective qualities of situations, not of individuals, that are experienced in a very holistic, blurred, and very pathic manner. And the key thing here, or the structural thing here, is that they are not felt as belonging to the individual, but they are felt as alterations, tensions, affective gradients of the situation in which the individual is immersed. So here, the interesting part of affective atmospheres is that they permeate this self-worth boundary, not, strictly speaking, not belonging to the individual. And lastly, existential feelings refer to the basic and tacit form of subject-word relatedness, of self-worth relatedness. And they can be seen as experience of the widest field of potentialities for change. So think, for instance, feelings of vitality, openness, familiarity, and so on. They open up the possibility of any other kind of intentional states available to the individual. So if we think, for instance, of the existential crisis or the existential anguish, might even deprive the individual with of the basic orientation in the world. So the idea here is that what existential feelings brings to the present is that is this possibility of dissolving the psychological boundary and the sensory boundaries of the self into the vastness of the world. So these, they can even move this self-centeredness of experience. So I would say that, strictly speaking, existential feelings are not subjective feelings, but they belong to a previous phase where this self-worth boundary is not structured yet. So how is this relevant for our understanding of mental disorders? So as you may already know, the enactive approach has been recently and systematically applied to the study of mental disorders, where mental disorders are defined as disorders of sense-making, which emerge from dynamic and nonlinear interaction within the organic, sensory, motor, and intersubjective domains. But I think the crucial point here is that they emerge at the level of the organism as a whole, as opposing to other more neuroreductionist perspective. And I think this is important because they compromise the coherence of the self. And this is the difference between, at least the Han would put it that way, the difference between somatic and mental disorders, because mental disorders compromise this coherence of the self-worth relationship. So from an enactive perspective, mental disorders involve disorders of affectivity. And the idea is not that only traditionally defined as mood disorders, such as anxiety and depression, can be seen as disorders of affectivity, but all forms of mental conditions involve disturbances in affective framing this self-worth relationship. And Mayers has recently stressed this point, for instance. And this results in a diminishment of metastability, a diminishment of potentialities for change, and consequently also impairments in flexibly adapting to new situations. So, and this process may go astray either by being too flexible or too rigid. But either way, they all involve a diminishment of effective potentialities for self-individuation. And as I said in the beginning, this is not very informative. Well, it is, but we need to make some distinctions here. And my proposal is that different affective modes can tell us about how the affective dynamism of sense-making is disturbed in each mental disorder and in each person. So actually, I think we can find similarities and correspondences between the intentional structure of affective modes and different psychopathologies. So, for instance, in schizophrenia is characterized by a disorder at the ipseity or the basic I word structure. So delusions in schizophrenia, the idea is that they do not present only a disorder in the meaning making of the word, but also a loss in the minimal self. That is this ego centrality or 0-point basic orientation of experience. The self-worth boundary is very unstable, so to speak. Therefore, I think we can relate schizophrenia with an existential phase. The idea here is that while in non-pathological states, existential feelings such as the sense of reality, vitality, openness, or familiarity are tacit and unquestioned. They are at the background of our experience. In schizophrenic disorders, these existential feelings are at the forefront of experience in a very unstable and disorganized manner. So the patient lives in potentialities, like possibilities that are perceived as actualities in hallucinations and delusions. And in depression, for instance, I think depression can be regarded as a disorder at the atmospheric level, because depression is characterized not only by being in a sad mood, but a kind of atmosphere of affective indifference, that is where nothing is saliently meaningful. However, in depression, at least in typical cases, this self-worth boundary is still maintained, but is highly permeable. So for instance, the world is seen as gray and gloomy as I feel myself. And in the anxiety spectrum, in turn, there is a strong and very rigid sense of self-worth distinction, with a kind of hypersensibility to perturbations of that boundary. So there is an urge to self-preservation that reduces metastability and effective potentialities for change. And here, anxiety disorders, I think they can be seen as disorders of moods, as I said before, as a kind of objectless fear, where the world is written in a very vague and indeterminate manner. And instead, phobias or OCD can be seen as disorders at the emotional level, because they feel this vagueness of anxiety with different and sometimes arbitrary contents. And they also involve a kind of fixation in action readiness and a fixation in the field of affordances perceived. So just to finish or to conclude, I have to say that this classification does not imply that OCD patients do not feel atmospheres or that only psychotic patients have existential issues. Not at all. Indeed, in a way, every illness, I think it can be seen as a kind of existential condition. But what it highlights is that we can find these analogies between the flexibility and coherence of the self-worth relationship in different psychopathologies and the intentional structure of different affective modes. And I think making these distinctions between structurally different forms of affective experiences can be very helpful, both for quantitative and more precisely for qualitative studies. Like, I think it's important to make these distinctions and how the sense of self is disturbed in each psychopathology. And this classification obviously is not meant to be exhaustive and could ideally incorporate other mental disorders such as borderline personality disorders, bipolar disorders, depersonalization, and so on. But I think this is a matter of further research. And another, I don't want to go into details here, but another open question is how to integrate this intersubjective aspect of affects within this picture. And I think here there is a crucial point that affective forms are also intersubjective phenomena, and they function as modulators of the intersubjective field. And I think making those distinctions between modes, structurally different modes of affectivity, can be particularly helpful to understand how interaffectivity operates in therapeutic settings. But I'm afraid that this is a topic for our next paper, but we can also discuss it later if you are interested in. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Enara. That is a sort of a rich and interesting topic here with plenty to discuss. So thanks very much for that. We have another interlocutor here with us. Nathaniel Barrett from the University of Nevada is online with us. So Nat may have a question or two. And as is my want, Nat, if you, I prefer to hear voices other than mine. So if you have a question to get started with, then I'll defer to yourself, although there's plenty I want to get stuck into as well. So
sure. It was a fascinating talk. This is my first time encountering your work, and I'm really interested to read the papers that you're drawing on here. So I'm sure some of the details, some of the questions that I have might be answered in that other work. But I have just to start off, I have a question about valence, and which is a basic trait of affect that you mentioned. And maybe if you can, are you able to go backwards in your slides? If you could go back to where you have all the different, there we go. Yeah. So my understanding is that affectivity, as you're understanding it coming out of these perspectives, is it has to do with converting potential aspects of individual identity into actual. And the potential is described in terms of metastability. And then there are all these different levels at which that happens, and that those correspond, these different levels of individuality, conversion into actuality. So individual making, they correspond to different aspects of affect, like which works very nicely in this model. So as this is my first encounter, so just as I'm trying to, I see the relationship with Colin Betty's work and others, and how they understand affectivity, usually as having some relationship with identity of the organism. But usually, if I'm understanding that correctly, valence in that case is then determined by what contributes to the maintenance of that identity or its integrity and so forth, or what perhaps disturbs that, threatens it with disintegration. And that's, I think, where they get valence out of, in that understanding of how affect is really fundamental to the organism world interaction. In this case, it seems like, in a way that I find really fascinating, it seems that you're putting a new twist on it, because it really has to do with individuation, rather than just like preservation of a formal identity or something. And that's really interesting to me. But I wanted to ask you, so what then would valence be on this model? That's
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I think you are tackling at the key point of this presentation and my proposal. Yeah, let me say a few things. First, here, let's say that the individuation of the organic being, like the living being, and the individuation of our experiences are kind of overlapping or very intertwined, are understood in a very intertwined manner. So individuation can be applied both to the physical or the organic individuation of the living being, but also to our experiences, so our stream of experience. So, and it's true that here the proposal is not to take this individual as an already constituted subject, but as how this subject is emerging from the ongoing process. So this makes a kind of paradoxical situation where valence is usually conceived as, let's say, that a kind of static normative property of the organism or of the system that needs to adaptively, ongoingly, but adaptively cope with changes in the environment, but there is a kind of inherent normativity to it. And I think that Simondon wants to shift that and say that, yes, okay, if we take the static individual, there is already a normative valence of what is positive and negative, but this is not the starting point. So he would say that this, let's say, valence or this normativity is also emergent from the interaction. So I think a key distinction between Varela and Simondonian perspective would be that Varela is taking this valence as primary, that as a primary affective relation with the world, and Simondon would say that no, this polarity of positive and negative is emergent from a more, let's say, pre-individual way of understanding it, from like different forces, affective forces that pull this system to different ways, and through individuation will bring forth a kind of positive and negative valence. And I do think that both processes, so they are highly compatible, but just a shift in perspective. I would say that normativity in an individual is not static. It's also something that goes changing. And to understand that change in our norms, we need to understand or take this process perspective of the individuation. So yes, you're right, that from an static perspective, valence is a kind of primary, but from an individuation perspective is something that changes. And it's true that sometimes in the enactive approach, we talk about normativity as being responding to the self-maintenance of the organism, but organisms do not just self-maintain, but they transform themselves. And that's the thing, that in order to understand this transformation in the way, in the organization, and transformation in our understanding of ourselves, in our identities, we need to take this process perspective, I would say.
So if I get your answer correctly, you said that there's a kind of valence which is emergent, and that is anchored somehow in the identity of the organism, although that's fluid and it's transformed. And that transformative possibility, as well as the emergence of valence, come out of what for you are, you call them affective forces. Affective forces in a sense that is prior to valence.
I would say that they are they are coexisting. So you have already an affective pole of pleasant and unpleasant, but beyond that, there are different forces that also change this affective pole.
Okay, I think. Okay, I think I see that. It's very, I mean, the turn to individuation, and I think you agree that it is new in the enactive framework, this sort of turn towards more individuation rather than self-maintenance.
Yeah.
That
Yes, and I think I would say that it's a kind of necessary step to do, because, as I said, organisms do not just self-maintain and preserve themselves, but they are one of the key things in life is that we grow.
right.
And in order to understand this ontogenetic, this growing aspect of life, yeah, I think it's necessary.
I totally agree. I'll just, I mean, I'll hand it to Marek, but I wrote a critique, a sort of appreciative, friendly critique of normativity in an active theory a while ago, and it was precisely on this point that I didn't think that the theory of normativity was working, was that it seemed to be too conservative, too related to maintenance of a formal identity, one that could persist through changes of materials, but the formal identity itself could not change according to the way normativity was defined. So there could be no change of form. And I thought, well, life is nothing if not a continual change of form, and how there could be no norms for changes of form based on the way normativity was, so it had to be extra normative. It had to be just something that just happened. But I thought that didn't seem right. But I like what you're doing. It seems like you are finding a way around that. So
yeah, it's a pity. Marek already sent to me your paper on that, and I didn't have time to read it. But I'm sure that we can find like
it's all. No, you're past it now. You don't need to read it.
Yeah. No, of course I will.
I will promote myself in another way. I've just published a book about affect, and there's, I mean, since I've been interested in activism, I'm sure there's some influence there, but my principal sources are Dewey and Whitehead, and there is some kind of, I mean, because you started out with a process relational ontology as being somehow, in some saying, more basic than the emergence of the kind of valence and dynamic that a person that constitutes valence in terms of moods and so forth. And that is, I mean, that's something that I find really resonates with perspective that I built there, and for probably for good reason, because Merleau-Ponty read Whitehead, and so it could have been some of that taken up by, I don't know, Simondon, but precisely this point on like his interest in ontology, but maintaining a kind of process relational. That's basically what you could say of Whitehead as well, and the emphasis on individuation is also important. So lots of points of connection. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks. So, and nice plug there, Nat. But as I can confirm to Enara and in fact to the other viewers that Nathaniel has already agreed to plug to a longer sort of more detailed plug of said text. We'll be hearing from Nathaniel in a later ENSO seminar. We just have to pin down a few details, so I'm looking forward to that. So question from Fred Cummins here coming in on YouTube. I'll just throw this one out there to you. So to make use of Simondon, do we need to recognize a rather different metaphysical basis in characterizing the virtual and the actual, for example? There's always I guess a threat of I mean, it's characteristic of the enactive approach in general, right? That you know, pull anything that you think is solid ground out from under you. But in this case, are we also caught up in a sort of a sweep of, you know, we've a broad metaphysical shift here in order to incorporate Simondon? Or do you think that it doesn't necessarily involve that bigger shift for an enactive framework. Fred does. He does add a disclaimer that he finds Simondon very difficult to understand. So,
no, I absolutely agree. It's not an easy read, but yeah, I would say that. So, if I get the question correctly, do we need to do a kind of metaphysical shift to incorporate this idea of the pre-individual, potential, and individual, and so on, like the Simondonian proposal? Yes, it's a process ontology. So I think, and I think there is some kind of discrepancy with different people, but I do think that enactivism implicitly endorses a process metaphysical framework, although it's not made explicit yet. And that's why maybe Nathaniel and I and others are going to Whitehead, Simondon, because they have this ontological system that somehow makes explicit, I think, what is implicit in an active approach, I would say. But not everybody would agree with that, maybe. The thing is that, yeah, do we need to shift depending from where? From an essentialist ontology, I think enactivism is is far away from an essentialist perspective, especially when we are talking about mental conditions and mental disorders. But then what's the alternative, right? So is the only alternative a process metaphysics? Well, maybe that's something that we need to figure out together. But yes, I'm a kind of inclined to adopt a process ontology, not as a kind of metaphysical, like ultimate, like claims about ultimate reality, but it's because I think it contributes to better understand mental conditions. I do think that mental conditions should be understood as dynamic processes, not as essential properties of certain individuals. So at least in this instrumental way, I would be inclined for a process perspective. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, I think. And I think I fully agree with you on that point about the process ontology, that, you know, it very much, I think, is implicit. So the extent to which we have Simondon and Whitehead to draw on, it just disciplines what enactive thinking was already doing. It was sort of, it gives us a kind of more developed set of tools for putting or getting to work with some of these ideas, I think. So if I might, we might have time for just one more question, and if I might rudely and selfishly take that question myself, which relates to actually the diagram that you're displaying at the moment, and that relationship between whether the temptation is sort of, of course, to call them levels, which they aren't. They're sort of scales or domains. And there's sort of a few different ways in which these kinds of nested structures tend to show up in enactive thinking, right? So the organic, sensory motor, and intersubjective bodies, and so on. And what I'm always curious about is the interaction between them. So the extent to which emotions affect moods and moods affect emotions, and similarly moods and atmospheres, and so on. Do you feel that is there a set of tools or a set of concepts that you think are useful for particularly useful for trying to understand those kinds of interplays? Or do you think this is kind of an open question that we might recognize that there is an interplay between these different phenomena, but at present we haven't theorized them well? It's just it's a fixation of mine. I'm always on the lookout. I'm always curious when I find someone else working on the similar kind of issue. I'm very curious to see what kinds of tools you find useful to think about in these terms.
That's a good question. I don't know, it's a kind of also ambivalent, I have ambivalent thoughts, because I don't see these emotions, mood, atmospheres, and these different modes of affective experience as categorical. So I would see them more as a kind of continuum, like a kind of, yeah, as a matter of scale, maybe. But it's true that then we can have, for instance, in a time scale, like a certain existential feeling of boredom, like existential boredom, and then feel a different atmosphere, so, or a different emotion. So we can have like existential feelings or emotions that are not completely aligned, that are actually intention, or atmosphere and emotions, for instance, the atmosphere of a party where everything is like very exciting and so on, but you can be in an emotion of sadness because a different thing. So these things coexist all the time. And also it's true that the kind of emotions we habitually have shape our habitual moods, and at the same time these larger scale processes do shape somehow the kind of emotions that we have available. I don't know, maybe these dynamical systems theories of nested processes at different timescales would be adequate to characterize that. But I'm not sure if I have seen in the literature like a really comprehensive dynamical systems approach that takes into account these four modes of affectivity. Yeah.
No, thanks for that. And I apologize for what was a little bit of a mean question, because but it is precisely that. I think this notion of interacting scales is showing up repeatedly, and it'll be interesting to see where we find the tools to put to use there. But I kind of love the diagram, and I'm curious as well about that. The relationship to individuality that sort of runs through it, then from these existential feelings where there might not be individuation is only just starting there. So that's a sort of, that is a big shift, as Nat has said, from the enactive thinking that basically has you're either an autonomous system or you're not, and there's a light switch when that circle gets closed. Whereas the suggestion here is that things are not as dichotomous, even at the earliest stages of individuation. So it'll be really interesting to see for these ideas to get drawn out and to sort of show them, as you're doing here, to sort of push them out into aspects of day-to-day experience. That there's precisely as you said in the answer to the question, that there's a continuum here that needs to be unpacked and explored in detail.
Yes.
So that was very much more comment than a question at the end. So, but we're pretty much at the end of our time here. So I want to say thank you very much. Again, obviously there's just a huge amount here, and I think it's really interesting. I think it's superb work, and I'm very grateful for you for sharing with it. We have a link on the ENSO Seminars webpage to the paper itself as well. So certainly people are encouraged to click on that and check it out and cite wildly for various other reasons. So thanks very much, Enara, for coming in, and we look forward to seeing your work more in future.
Thank you, Marek.
Thanks, Nat, as well. We'll hear from you more in future, and to those of you on watching the stream, we will hopefully see you again in a month's time for another ENSO seminar.